What's up guys, welcome to our Protection Paladin Tank Guide for Legion, patch 7.1. Now in this guide I'm going to go over your spells and abilities, your talents, your artifact traits and pathing choices, your stat priority, and then your tank rotation for both dungeon and raid situations, as well as demonstrations of each. And then I'll just go over some macros and add-ons that I use that you might find helpful. Now let's go ahead and jump into your spells and abilities, and I'm going to start with your offensive abilities. First one I want to talk about is Consecration, and it's an ability that puts this area of effect under your feet, like so, and anything that walks into it takes damage. It also actually buffs several of your abilities if you are standing in it as well, but we'll get to that when we go over those abilities. And one such ability is Hammer of the Righteous, and on its own it's a 2-charge ability with a short cooldown, and it does some damage in melee range, pretty simple. You just smack something. Now, if you are standing in Consecration with it, it will actually cleave around you. So everything within 8 yards will take extra damage as well. So, pretty simple ability. Has a cleave component if you are standing in Consecration. Next up, we've got Avenger's Shield. And this is a ranged ability, and it has a kind of medium level cooldown. Basically, you throw your shield, it does damage to the target it hits, it also interrupts and silences them for a couple seconds, and then it bounces to up to 2 extra targets. So it can hit up to 3 targets, but the other 2 targets it hits do not get interrupted or silenced, so only the first target does. And it looks something like this, it'll just kind of bounce off and do damage. If there was one more target, it would hit that target as well. Next we have Judgment, and Judgment is another ranged ability with a shorter cooldown. It does damage, and when you use it, it reduces the cooldown on another one of your abilities, called Shield of the Righteous, which we'll get into in just a second. It reduces that cooldown by 2 seconds, or 4 seconds if Judgment crits. So you just throw your hammer, it looks something like that. Now, Shield of the Righteous is your active mitigation button, and it's kind of an offensive slash defensive button in a way, because it does do damage. So it's in melee range and you hit something, and then it gives you a buff that reduces the damage you take by a certain percentage for 4.5 seconds. Now if you use this multiple times in a row before that buff expires, it will add on extra time to the duration, so it's not technically wasted if you accidentally double tap it or something. And it is notable that it is off the global cooldown, so you can kind of use it whenever. Now it has 3 charges and a fairly long cooldown, reduced by haste. So it just works like this, you smack something with it, and you get this buff, and it makes you take less damage. Now if you're standing in Consecration, you'll notice that it actually buffs that damage reduction that you have by 20%. So it's very important that you do, of course, stand in Consecration while you're using this, or at least while the buff is active. Now, I want to talk about a passive ability we have called Grand Crusader. And basically, when you avoid a melee attack, so if you dodge an attack, or you use Hammer of the Righteous, you have a % chance to reset the cooldown on Avenger's Shield. So just know that you will occasionally get more Avenger's Shields than you would think based on the cooldown. It will reset every now and again. So just good to know. Now as far as utility goes and defensive cooldowns, we do have quite a few options for defensive cooldowns actually. And the first I want to talk about is your artifact ability. Eye of Tear is a 1-minute cooldown, and it hits everything around you, and anything that gets hit gets a debuff applied to it, and that debuff makes them deal less damage to you. So essentially, it's a damage reduction cooldown, but you need to hit the targets with it. So it's got a range on it, you'll see kind of like this, and when it hits them, it puts this debuff up, and they deal less damage to you. And a 25% damage reduction is pretty significant for such a short cooldown, so it's very, very nice to use. The next one we have is Ardent Defender. Ardent Defender is a 2-minute cooldown. Mine's a little bit shorter because of artifact traits, but it reduces the damage you take by 20%, so a little bit less. But if you die while you have Ardent Defender active, you'll actually survive, you'll lose the buff, and it will put you to 12% max health. Now do you know, it won't prevent you from dying again because it's gone, so you can still die at 12%, but it's nice if you're taking a big spike of damage perhaps, and you're not certain that you want to blow your next cooldown, which I'll go over in a second, because it's such a long cooldown. It's going to be really, really useful, and it is 20% damage reduction, which is quite nice. Now, the next cooldown we have is probably one of our biggest ones, Guardian of Ancient Kings, 5-minute cooldown, and it cuts the damage you take in half, so 50% damage reduction. Pretty simple, very long cooldown. Use it when you're about to take big damage. Now, we do have Avenging Wrath, and this can be considered both an offensive and defensive cooldown because it buffs your damage and healing for 20 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown. How you use this kind of depends on your situation and what you want and what you need. Obviously, you can use it for damage, just pop wings, do more damage, or you can use it for the healing bonus that it gives you, which is pretty big and pretty significant. Now, as far as healing goes, we do have an ability called Light of the Protector by default, and this is kind of your main heal as a prop paladin. It is on a kind of medium cooldown, and basically it heals you for a percentage of your missing health. So the lower your health is at the time that you cast this, the more it heals you. Thus, it's really nice for spiking yourself back up if you get low. And it doesn't really matter if you got low over time, or if you got spikes down low. It just looks at how much health you're missing, and heals you based on that. Note that if you're standing in Consecration, this actually gets buffed to this heal, so again, good to standing in Consecration. Also note that this is off the global cooldown, meaning you can pretty much pop this whenever, and you won't have to worry about like using an ability right beforehand. So it's pretty nice in that way. We also do have Flash of Light. You can use this, it's a casted spell, and it takes mana. So you won't be using this too often, but there are times you can use it, like if you're not tanking, or to pick yourself up after a trash pack in a dungeon or something, or just to spot heal in a raid perhaps if you're not tanking at the time. But generally you'll be doing other stuff if you can, especially if you're actively tanking. Finally, we do have Lay on Hands, and Lay on Hands is a giant cooldown, 10-minute cooldown, basically kind of once per fight, and it heals a target for basically your max health. Now in this case, it would be about 2.7 million for me. And then it applies a debuff called Forbearance. Now Forbearance prevents the target from receiving certain effects from abilities that cause Forbearance. And the abilities you have, aside from Lay on Hands, that cause this are Divine Shield, which is kind of it's an immunity. It causes you to be immune to everything for 8 seconds. And of course it applies Forbearance as well. And again, if you have Forbearance already from something else, you can't use this until that goes away. Also note that Divine Shield will get rid of your aggro, it'll drop aggro, so be very careful about using it, because they're going to move to the next target, of course, and probably kill them, depending on what's going on. So just be careful with that. You can do stuff like taunt when you have the shield up, and it will work for 3 seconds while the taunt is active, but you do lose your aggro, so just be aware of that. Now, the other ability you have is Blessing of Protection, and Blessing of Protection, it's 5-minute cooldown, you can put it on anyone, and it prevents all physical damage from happening to them, and it removes all physical debuffs and prevents applications of those as well. So it's basically physical damage immunity. And of course, it does apply Forbearance, so the same rules apply. If they have Forbearance, you can't put this on until it's gone. Now, along with Blessing of Protection, we have 2 more blessings that kind of provide utility. The first is Blessing of Freedom, and this applies a buff to the target that removes roots and snares and makes them immune to those effects for the duration. Blessing of Sacrifice is a 2.5-minute cooldown, and it basically makes the target take 30% less damage, but all that damage that they would have taken is instead transferred to you. So just make sure you're prepared that you don't kill yourself with it. Although it does drop off, so if your health would dip below 20%, it will automatically just take Blessing of Sacrifice off, so you don't actually kill yourself from the blessing, but it's still very dangerous because it'll put you low, potentially. So just be aware of how you use that, and when you use it and who you're using it on. Now, of course, we do have a movement ability in Divine Steed. It's a 45-second cooldown normally. I have a talent that's reducing it right now, but 45 seconds. And for 3 seconds, you get basically an epic mount, even in combat, and it's kind of your movement speed boost. Pretty long cooldown and pretty short effect, so just make sure you use it for big bursts of movement, but that's kind of what you have as a prop paladin for movement. Now, of course, we have our taunt in Hand of Reckoning. Pretty basic, 8-second cooldown, taunts the target. And then we have some utility in Interrupts with Rebuke, and our 1-minute stun, or 6-second stun on a 1-minute cooldown rather, in Hammer of Justice. And of course we do have a Dispel, Cleanse Toxins, removes poisons and diseases from the friendly target. Generally won't be using this, but if a fight calls for it, you might as well kind of help out if you can. But that's up to your raid composition and what your raid leader needs. Alright, so now let's talk about your talents. Now in your first tier, I recommend Blessed Hammer, and what it does is it replaces your Hammer of the Righteous with an ability, with a new ability with 3 charges called Blessed Hammer, and it just summons this hammer, and you notice it doesn't follow you, but it just kind of spins around a bit bigger and bigger until it goes away. And every time it hits a target, their next auto attack will do less damage to you. So it's really nice, constant, consistent, and reliable damage reduction when you're tanking. And note that it can hit a target multiple times as it's traveling, so the uptime is pretty nice on it. It's pretty high, and again, it's kind of guaranteed when you use it, it will have an effect. Now, if you don't like this for whatever reason, maybe you don't like the fact that it doesn't follow you around, maybe you just don't like it for some reason, you can use Holy Shield. It's not bad. It increases your block chance, which is nice, and it allows you to block spells, which is also quite nice. And every time you do block, you actually deal some damage back to the attacker. Now, the reason it's not quite as good is it is tied to your block chance, so it's a little RNG-ish. So you could get unlucky and not get a lot of blocks, thus making it not as useful, of course. And also, we do have magic damage reduction now, just through Shield of the Righteous, which used to just do physical damage, but now it also does spell damage, so it does all the kinds of damage. So it's not quite as important that we need to be able to block spells, and again, it's just less consistent and reliable than Blessed Hammer, but it's not bad at all. So this is a nice choice if you really don't like Blessed Hammer for whatever reason. Now, Consecrated Hammer, I don't really recommend in too many situations. It removes your cooldown on Hammer of the Righteous, and it makes it so that all the abilities that benefit from Consecration will always benefit from Consecration, even if you're not standing in it. But it's really not that useful because it's not hard to stand in your Consecration most of the time you're tanking, and you should be anyway. So it's not that useful because it's so easy to do that properly with good planning and play. So all you really get from this is Hammer of the Righteous having no cooldown, which is not that big a benefit compared to the other two. So I really recommend Blessed Hammer, or if you don't want that, Holy Shield. Now level 30, all these talents are viable in different situations, so I'll go ahead and go over them briefly and then discuss when you should use them. First Avenger makes Avenger's Shield do more damage to the first target you hit, and Grand Crusader, that proc you have that resets Avenger's Shield, has a higher chance to occur. So it's 15% by default, with First Avenger is 25%. Bastion of Light, it's a 2-minute cooldown ability, and it just gives you 3 charges of your Shield of the Righteous back. Basically, kind of a cooldown, gives you all your active mitigation back. Obviously, you probably want to use this when you're completely out of Shield of the Righteous and not even close to getting that first charge back. Pretty simple. Now, Crusader's Judgment got changed in this most recent patch. It now gives Judgment 2 charges instead of 1. As you can see, if you take it, you get 2 charges of Judgment, and when Grand Crusader does proc, it gives you your Avenger's Shield still, gives you that reset, and it also gives you a charge of Judgment back. So basically this allows you to have more Judgments, which in turn allows you to have more Shield of the Righteous uptime because it reduces the cooldown on this. And so it kind of does a similar effect to Bastion of Light, but rather than being on a cooldown and all at once, it's kind of more constant and consistent. Now as far as when to use these, I recommend First Avenger if you are 1, doing single target tanking and you want more damage, but 2, in any kind of AoE situation, especially in like dungeons and Mythic Plus runs, I do recommend First Avenger. The extra procs it gives you of Avenger's Shield are really nice for DPS boost, as well as the fact that with one of your artifact traits, Avenger's Shield actually gains a defensive component, in which the damage it does kind of gives you an absorb shield. So it helps with the damage, which is very important in Mythic dungeons, and it also kind of helps do a little bit of absorbing, because in AoE pools you will get the full benefit of 3 targets being hit by your shield and such. So I do recommend it for Mythic Plus runs, and I suppose if you really want to increase your DPS on like single target or something, then this would also be a good choice for that. Now, Bastion of Light and Crusader's Judgment, as I mentioned, kind of do a similar effect, getting you more Shield of the Righteous charges. The thing is, the choice comes down to kind of what you need. Now, Bastion of Light is a cooldown, and it's technically will give you more charges of Shield of the Righteous per 2 minutes, which is the cooldown on this, than Crusader's Judgment will on average. But you do get all the charges at once. So it can be kind of wonky to use if you're not really sure how you want to use that. You would want to use it basically when you need cooldown. So if you think you need an extra cooldown, or you want to use Shield of the Righteous a lot more, and you know there's a point where you're gonna need more of those, then Bastion of Light is a good choice. But that can be kind of awkward to work around. So Crusader's Judgment is another good choice for single target like raid tanking when having higher uptime on Shield of the Righteous is important, but you don't want to be restricted to having them burst all at the same time, kind of getting all those charges at once. Again, you will technically get less, you get fewer Shield of the Righteous charges if you use this talent on average every 2 minutes, but it does happen more often, so it allows you to judgment more often, and it kind of adds another component to the rotation. More judgments means there's less downtime, which is kind of nice. So, kind of up to you there what you need, more cooldown based and more consistent based, but both of these I would recommend for like raid tanking, especially if there's a lot of boss tanking rather than ad tanking. Now level 45, we got your CC talents. Fist of Justice, if you need more stuns. This Judgment reduces the remaining cooldown on your Hammer of Justice if you take this talent, so it'll get you that stun up more often. Repentance, it's a casted CC, pretty simple. It breaks on damage, it incapacitates them though. I don't really recommend this most of the time in PvE settings, so don't really recommend that. Now, Blinding Light is quite good. It's a 1.5 minute cooldown and it disorients everything around you. And it looks something like that. Anything that gets hit by that is disoriented, so you can kind of use this as an interrupt of sorts in like dungeons and such, or if there are ads that are important to interrupt and you can't get to them, or your interrupts are on cooldown or whatever, or there's a lot of them, you can use this to temporarily interrupt because it does break. This disorient effect does break if they're hit by non-holy damage, but it will stop them the first time. Say like the imps in Court of Stars. If they're also kind of channeling that nasty spell that destroys your party, you could use this to stop them and they'll probably go back to casting something else. Can be useful that way. It also does a significant amount of damage, so you can use it for AoE damage as well. Now level 60, we have some interesting choices. Now I want to make mention of Blessing of Spell Warding. This replaces your Blessing of Protection. It's on a 3-minute cooldown and it basically does the same thing as Blessing of Protection except for magic damage rather than physical damage. So it still causes forbearance, so you still get that debuff, but basically it removes all magic debuffs and prevents all magic damage from happening. If there's use for this on a fight, then I recommend this 100% of the time, but it's not always useful on fights, so if it's not useful, then we'll take one of the other 2 talents. But fights that come to mind, like Mythic Thendra, perhaps for Volatile Rod or something, Elareth Renferal, perhaps on Mythic for that Twister, that those violent winds she does, things like that can be really, really useful for cheesing mechanics and such. If you're not taking this though, if Blessing of Protection is more useful or there's no real like magic damage that's scary, then you can take Cavalier for extra movement speed, so it gives you another charge of Divine Steed, which is always nice. And then you have Retribution, or I don't really like that much. It just makes it so that when you get hit or people around you get hit, they do some damage back if they're getting melee hit. I don't find it that useful. It doesn't add any survivability. The damage it does is pretty measly, and I'm sure it builds up, but I kind of like having movement speed, having the option of having movement speed, or of course Blessing of Spell Warding if it's useful. Level 75, we've got good talents here as well. The one I tend to default to is Hand of the Protector, and it replaces your Light of the Protector, and it does the same amount of healing, but what it does is it lowers the cooldown, as you noticed. It's at 7.81 seconds for me right now, and Light of the Protector is about 11.7, so it's significantly shorter, and you can actually cast it on anybody, any friendly target. So you can actually spot heal other people as well, if you need to, which can come in handy. Now, if you don't want that, if you're not really concerned about that, you can take Knight Templar. It reduces the cooldown of Divine Steed by half, which is nice, so it's a 22.5 second recharge rather than a 45 second. And while it's active, while you're riding your horse around, you actually take 20% less damage. So it's kind of like a mini cooldown. It's very short though, as compared to your other cooldowns like Ardent Defender is 8 seconds. Eye of Tyr is 9 seconds, so it's very short compared to those. But technically it can be a nice little damage reduction, especially if you're just doing it for like a hit. But that's something to consider. Can be useful. Now, Final Stand makes it so that when you Divine Shield, you taunt everything around you within 15 yards for 8 seconds. This turns your Divine Shield into kind of a viable cooldown because you'll use this, you'll bubble, and you actually won't lose aggro on your target, and in fact you'll AoE taunt everything around you. So for the full duration of the bubble, you'll still have aggro. So Final Stand makes it so that you have an extra cooldown, if you will, without losing any aggro and such. So it can be useful if you need that, or if you think you need an AoE taunt every 5 minutes. But generally, I recommend one of the other two, just depending on what you prefer and what you need. You know, extra healing or damage reduction from Knight Templar. At level 90, you have some really interesting talents. The one I recommend for raids is Judgment of Light. The Judgment of Light applies a debuff when you Judgment, and basically anyone that hits this target will actually get healed for a little bit. So it kind of helps your DPS heal up on their own. And it has 40 stacks, and that goes down as people hit it and get healed. And so you just keep this up, and since you're using Judgment anyway on as part of your rotation, it gets kind of passive healing for the entire raid. Now, it's not that useful in dungeons and such because there's so many targets, and it only applies to the one target that it hits. So it's more useful in a raid boss, for example. But in a dungeon, you might prefer something like Consecrated Ground. And Consecrated Grounds basically turns your consecration into a bit of a minor heal for anyone standing in it, so melee especially. But more importantly, it actually applies a slow now to your consecration, so you can kite better, which can be very useful depending on the affixes you have in your Mythic Keystone dungeons and such. So this can be a really good choice if you're doing Mythic Dungeon runs, especially with a lot of melee, or if you think you might need to kite. And if not, Aegis of Light is actually a really nice cooldown. It's a 5-minute cooldown, can be useful in raids mostly, and it's basically a 20% damage reduction for people behind you. So if they're standing behind you within 10 yards, that actually reduces the damage they take for 6 seconds by 20%, which is a pretty decent cooldown. It's kind of like Devotion Aura from Holy Paladins, but with a much smaller range, and people will have to stand behind you. Now, if you really need a cooldown and you're going to be stacked for a fight, this could be really nice, but kind of up to your raid and what you need. Now, level 100, we've got 3 great talents for different situations. Righteous Protector, I would recommend generally for raid, kind of tanking, boss tanking, and just makes it so that when you use your Shield of the Righteous, you reduce the remaining cooldown on your Light of the Protector and your wings, so your heal and your wings, your Venging Wrath, by 3 seconds. So it just lets you use those abilities more often, more self-healing, and more Avenging Wrath for, again, more self-healing and also damage. Now, Seraphim is the go-to talent for DPS if you want to do more damage. It takes 2 charges of your active mitigation, that Shield of the Righteous, which is why it's not quite as good defensively. But for every charge that it does consume, it lasts 8 seconds. And so it buffs all of your secondary stats. So your haste, crit, mastery, and versatility. So if you take 1 charge, you get 8 seconds of this buff. And if you take 2 charges, you get 16 seconds. Now, Last Defender, I really recommend for dungeons, especially if you're doing big pools, lots of adds, and it's just a passive ability, and every enemy within 8 yards of you reduces the damage that you take, and it also increases the damage that you do by 3% per enemy. It has diminishing returns according to the tooltip. I'm not entirely certain how severe those diminishing returns are, but this does allow you to pull really big in dungeons and survive very well. It also increases the damage you do, which is important in dungeons, even as a tank. So Last Defender is really good for Mythic Keystone dungeons, I find. Now, let's go over your artifact traits and kind of pathing choices. You're going to start here, of course, at your ability. Grab Truth God's Light, because you have to. And then I recommend going over to the left here to grab Bulwark of Order. Now, this is the trait that I mentioned earlier that makes your Avenger's Shield have a defensive component. When you Avenger's Shield with this, it gives you an absorbed shield for half the damage that it dealt. So the more that your Avenger's Shield does, the more of a bubble you get from it. You get some nice talents along the way, nice traits. Righteous Crusader is really good for defensive purposes. You pick that up along the way. And then I recommend going up to the top, Tears Enforcer. So you'll grab Hammer Time and Consecration and Flame, which is really nice. This increases the duration of Consecration, so you don't have to use it on cooldown to kind of keep it up. So you have a couple extra seconds of leeway. Now, Tears Enforcer just does extra damage, kind of AoE damage. It's linked to your Avenger's Shield. Basically, you use the shield and it kind of explodes an AoE around everything that it hits. As you can see, it kind of pulses, a little AoE. So it's extra damage. That extra damage that it does, though, does not count toward Bulwark, just as a note, but it is still nice for some extra DPS. After that, I'd probably recommend self-healing here, a little boost to your Light of the Protector, and Unflinching Defense, your Ardent Defender cooldown reduction, which is why mine is not 2 minutes anymore. Kind of whatever you prefer, what you need more in your general tanking. I generally recommend the heal more, but if you want a more like a lower cooldown on your Ardent Defender, you can use that, of course. And then from there, I'd probably recommend getting Light of the Titans. It's not the biggest upgrade, but it'll make your heal apply a heal over time. But it's a pretty small heal over time because the time that it heals over is quite large, 15 seconds. So it's not doing that much, but it's there and it's extra healing, so it's always nice. And then at that point, you can kind of pick what you want. I probably recommend Painful Truths last because I just don't think it's that great. Maybe Stern Judgment because it increases the crit strike chance of your judgment, which gets you more 4-second cooldown reductions on your Shield of the Righteous rather than 2. But they're all kind of so-so, you know. Blessing of Sacrifice, I don't find that I use this too often, but you can if you do. This is pretty good, but the last 4 here, Stern Judgment, Forbearant Faithful, Painful Truths, and Sacrifice of the Just, not that great. So I just save those for last, kind of up to you what you want there. As far as relics go, kind of depends what you're looking for. If you want lots of AoE damage, more AoE damage, then I recommend Consecration and Flame. Having this Consecration last longer makes it do more damage, and they do stack, so if you layer multiple Consecrations down in the same area, it will do more damage, so you're not losing damage if you kind of overlap them. So this is good for nice AoE damage, like in dungeons and stuff, if that's important to you. And for defensive purposes, generally Righteous Crusader will probably be your best. It does increase the damage you do with Shield of the Righteous, but it also reduces the damage by more. So it increases that damage reduction that it does for every level that you have it. So for damage reduction, I do recommend that. And for kind of damage or AoE damage, I recommend Consecration and Flame. Now as far as stats go, you're going to want Haste pretty much as your top stat. Haste reduces the cooldown on pretty much all your abilities that you use in your rotation. Judgment, Shield of the Righteous, Blessed Hammer, or Hammer of the Righteous. Consecration, Avenger's Shield, and even your self-heal. So it applies to a lot of stuff, and it keeps you doing more damage, and keeping your active mitigation and healing up more often. Now after Haste, we have Versatility, is what I recommend. And Versatility is actually probably a better defensive stat than Haste, technically, just because it's always active, you're always healing more, doing or taking less damage and such. But because it doesn't increase your damage as much, and it doesn't smooth out your rotation the way that Haste does, I do recommend this after Haste. But it's a very nice defensive stat for you. Pretty simple though. It just increases your damage and healing, and decreases the damage you take. After that, I recommend Mastery for survivability. This increases the damage reduction from your Shield of the Righteous, that active mitigation, increases your block chance, and increases your attack power. Now, it doesn't scale super well, so it's not quite as good as Versatility or Haste, but it does increase your active mitigation damage reduction, so that's pretty important. Now, Critical Strike increases your parry chance and, of course, gives you that Judgment chance to kind of reduce the Shield of the Righteous cooldown more than the 2 seconds that it normally does. But it just doesn't happen enough and doesn't help quite as much as the other stats in terms of keeping that uptime, especially versus Haste, of course. And for Mastery, like, you have it up more often, but it's not doing as much. And the parry chance is nice, but it's just, as far as survivability goes, crit is not that great. So I put this last. Now, if you're more interested in doing like high damage on your Paladin, then crit is much, much more valuable. But for survivability, which is what I'm going to be talking about most of the time here, I recommend Haste, then Versatility, then Mastery, and then crit. But again, for damage, you can raise the priority on crit higher than probably even Versatility, but you'll be losing out on survivability for that. Now let's talk about your tanking rotation, and it is pretty similar for both dungeons and raids. The changes come in what you prioritize. Now I'll start with Shield of the Righteous and kind of how to use it. It's on a 3 charge system rather, and on a fairly large cooldown. Even though it's reduced by haste, you pretty much can't have 100% uptime right now on Shield of the Righteous because it only lasts 4.5 seconds. What this means is you have to kind of pick and choose when to use it. So you can't just spam it and expect it to be up all the time. So you consider things like if your other tank is tanking, then maybe you don't want to use it because you don't need to, because you're not taking damage, things like that. And just use it when you are tanking and also when you expect higher periods of damage. So you kind of get used to the flow of damage when stuff happens and prep it for that. Now it is off the global cooldown as I mentioned earlier, so you can use it whenever. You don't have to worry about accidentally putting it on cooldown just by using another ability. You can use it whenever, in between abilities and so on. Now, you also of course want to be standing in consecration pretty much the whole time, because that will buff your active mitigation as well as healing when you do that. So consecration is kind of really, really important to have active when you're tanking. So keep that, make sure that's rolling, and make sure you're standing in it. And after that, it kind of depends on what you need more. If you're looking for more tankiness, survivability, then you're going to want Judgment as kind of your higher priority, because that'll reduce the cooldown on Shield of the Righteous, and thus getting you higher uptime on that active mitigation. Now, if you're looking for more damage, then you would prioritize Avenger's Shield over Judgment, because it does more damage, especially with First Avenger, and it does apply a little bit of a Absorb Shield to you anyway based on the damage you do, once you get that golden trait. So, if you're looking for more damage, Avenger's Shield, or in like a dungeon, for example, it generally, on trash pools, will prioritize Avenging Wrath, or excuse me, Avenger's Shield, because it does a lot of damage and gets you pretty good shields because it's hitting 3 targets and such. Whereas on single target, like boss fights, or if I'm just taking like a raid boss, then I'll be using Judgment more often or prioritizing it a bit higher because it reduces the cooldown of my Shield of the Righteous, which is very important to surviving. Now, as far as Blessed Hammer usage goes, I generally try to weave this in between my abilities, so maybe I'll like start the pool with like a taunt and an Avenger Shield, and then, get Consecration rolling, and then it'll be like Blessed Hammer, Judgment, Blessed Hammer, what else is up, right? You use one of the abilities, maybe like Avenger Shield comes off cooldown, use that, Blessed Hammer, Judgment, Blessed Hammer, Consecration, something like that. That doesn't always have to be, perfectly in between abilities like that, but I generally try to weave it in so it smooths out the rotation a little bit. And also remember that Blessed Hammer does have that chance to reset Avenger's Shield, so kind of be aware of that when you cast it. Alright, so now I'll go ahead and show you guys some demonstrations of those. I'll start with the raid tanking setting and then the dungeon setting, and kind of discuss how the rotation, kind of show you how the rotation goes, and things to kind of think about as you tank those. So here I'll demonstrate kind of raid tanking a boss. Now you can see my talents on the left there, and you can see the abilities I cast on the left as well now. So I start with the boss, so I taunt, shield, do some ranged attacks, put Consecration down, use Shield of the Righteous because I need that active mitigation up. And then you can see I'm weaving in Blessed Hammer in between abilities. Now you notice I'm not always doing Blessed Hammer in between abilities. So sometimes I'll have like 2 abilities in a row. Kind of depends on what you need, but I do try to weave it in as much as possible to kind of smooth out the rotation. Now, I try to keep Shield of the Righteous up as much as possible, because I know when a tank taunts, like here where he taunts, I won't be having to use it as much. Now here I notice it's going to fall off before I get hit, so I pop a cooldown, Ardent Defender, just to make sure I don't take too much damage from it. Then you come back in, do some ranged attacks. Now my Shield of the Righteous is off cooldown completely, so I'll use one stack to kind of get it rolling, extra damage, why not? And then you notice I kind of spot heal here, Flash of Light, and I notice the DK is low, so I'll go ahead and hand out the Protector him. And then just kind of go back. Now I taunt off, so I'm tanking again. So Shield of the Righteous needs to be up. And I'm prioritizing Judgment because I want more Shield of the Righteousness. Now I have Tear here because I realize I don't have that many charges to shield. And it's a short cooldown, so I figure why not use it now to save some charges of my active mitigation. And here I pop Wings to kind of help with the self-healing because I don't want to pop my Guardian yet. I know there's probably a dicey situation coming up. And now at this point you notice I'm not tanking, so I'm not even touching my Shield of the Righteous, because there's no reason to. I'm not taking damage. Now as soon as she turns back, I will use it. And then we go into another phase where she stops doing damage. So it's all about using, prioritize Judgment over like Avenger's Shield in these situations, but also use your Shield of the Righteous when it's necessary, and only then, so that you have recharge time when like other tank is taunting, for example, or like here where you're not actually doing anything, you can't be in melee range, whatever. So kind of make use of what you can. Now here I spot heal, I could Flash of Light. I put down Consecration just to get a bigger heal on whoever I was going to use Hand of Protector on. And so just kind of use what you have available when you can. So switching between like actively tanking, rolling cooldowns, and spot healing or whatever you might need. Now for dungeon, I'll be using First Avenger and Last Defender and talents like that. So this allows you to pull much bigger here. So I'll pull like both groups in this dungeon, for example, and kind of get them together, and then get my active mitigation rolling. And I'll try to get consecration up as soon as I can. And you'll notice that Last Defender kind of allows you to take a lot less damage in bigger pools. And I'll be prioritizing a lot more Avenger's Shield, both for the slightly bigger absorb, thanks to it hitting at least 3 targets all the time, and also just for more damage. So I will use Judgment now and again to try to, just to fill in the blanks and get more cooldowns, more Shield of the Righteous up, but a lot of kind of Blessed Hammer more, just to proc more Avenger Shields, and just Avenger Shields to do more damage, get that bubble. Kind of, you can see you get pretty good damage from that. Now, well, as soon as you go down to single target, you can kind of rotate back to doing more judgments, but for trash packs mostly, you'll be doing that, kind of prioritizing Avenger Shield more. Now, I'm going to pull this entire pack, so I want to pop a big cooldown just to make sure that I don't die, so I just choose to do Guardian because I don't think I'm in much danger for the rest of the instance anyway. So I drop that, get my Shield of the Righteous up, and then start doing some AoE. A lot of Avenging Wrath to do lots of damage, kind of help out there, and then prioritize the shield. Now this pack, a lot of it died early, so it's not too dangerous, but that's pretty much how you'll kind of go with. It's the same kind of rotation, and just again, prioritize Avenger Shield, and that Last Defender is really nice for big pulls. It gets you a lot of damage reduction and self-sustain. As you can see on the healing meter, it actually counts for healing. Now I'll show you a little bit of a boss fight. It's kind of the same idea though as a raid boss, except you'll be using different talents probably because you're in a dungeon run. So for example, I'm using not Crusader's Judgment but First Avenger, and it's the same thing. I put Consecration down, kind of prioritize Judgment, weave those Blessed Hammers in between, and if you notice when he's doing things like Toxic Wretch, I'm not using my Shield of the Righteous because he's not actually hitting me. So just kind of use abilities that fit your needs and only use your active mitigation when you need to. Remember, there's not another tank typically in dungeons, so you will have to tank it most of the time, the bosses that is. So using your cooldowns and your active mitigation only when you need them is extra important in dungeons because you're kind of the only tank. So that's pretty much how tanking will go in a dungeon between trash and the boss. And you, again, just be smart about the way you use your active mitigation. Now, as far as macros and add-ons go, I don't really use many macros. I do have a cancelaura for Divine Shield and Blessing and Protection, just in case. Mildly useful. Say, like, you Divine Shield or you Blessing and Protection yourself, and then you taunt to keep aggro for 3 seconds. But then you actually get picked up. Your health gets back to a good spot within a couple seconds, and you're like, oh, I want my aggro back, but you don't want to... you don't want to wait for the buffs to go away. You can use this to remove the buff off yourself, and you'll be back on the aggro table. And you don't have to like search for the buff here and like try to click it off or anything. This allows you to just put it on a button. It's also nice if someone's trolling you with Blessed and Protection and there's like slapping it on you because they think it's funny or something. It makes it easier to remove it. Now as far as add-ons go, I do have a few here. The first is Weak Auras, which is very powerful, and you probably saw that a lot during the demonstrations. I've been tracking a bunch of stuff like cooldowns and stacks for my Shield of the Righteous, and then like Shield of the Righteous buff tracker, lists how much time is left on it, and indicator. You can do a lot of stuff with this, a lot of really cool things you can do. Now the flashing icon was from Doom Cooldown Pulse, and that just shows when stuff is off cooldown. I don't really recommend this though. It's kind of a very basic add-on, and it's kind of messing up right now. Sometimes it'll say stuff is off cooldown, it'll flash the icon, and it's not off cooldown yet. Plus, you can actually do the exact same effect in Weak Auras, and it'll be accurate, and it's just kind of better. I think I've just been a little lazy about getting rid of it, and if I don't have like Weak Auras set up on a new tune or something, I can use that as a kind of basic, very, very simplistic guide to like when stuff is off cooldown. So I keep it around, I suppose. But not highly recommended, but it's there if you're interested. Now for action bars, I've got Bartender 4. I just customized it this way. You can kind of do it however you like. And it's got a lot of options. So you can activate different bars, you can make them different sizes, there's stuff like that. For damage meters, I've got Skada right now. I have heard a lot of good things about another add-on called Details, so I would look into that if you're interested. I hear it's a bit better, but I haven't tried it, so I can't really recommend it. Of course, boss mods, I've got Deadly Boss mods. And then I've got Exorcist raid tools, and you probably saw the raid cooldowns on the right side of my screen. That was from this add-on. You can also do stuff, there's a bunch of cool stuff like Battle Res Timer, which I'm not using, it's actually another add-on I use for that. But you can like raid inspect, look at stuff, there's some cool things. You can see who pulled, so who like got initial aggro at least. Stuff like that, very, very cool. A lot of potential there. And then the add-on I was talking about, where I used just for the battle res pretty much, is ORA 3. And I just like this monitor a bit better because it tells me who rezzed as well as when the res is up and how many reses we have. But again, Exorcist Raid Tools does have that option anyway, so if you don't care who rezzed, then I could probably just recommend using that instead. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you guys like the video, please feel free to hit the video with a like. If you want to see when I put out more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.